Hi, this is Dr. Mike Barnes, and welcome to another video for our family program. This is a video we'll probably be sharing with our clients on a regular basis as well, because it's regarding something that's really important to our program. As a trauma-integrated addiction treatment program, the idea of working on trauma and addiction simultaneously is very critical. And so we're often talking about how do we manage the nervous system, maintain a state of calm, keep the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that has to do with decision making and problem solving and all of that stuff online so that treatment can be effective for our clients. But it's also really important in our family program as well. So you'll hear your loved ones, or you'll hear people who are in our residential programs talk about moving their marbles, or the marbles map, or the marbles example. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So, the ANS state map is the autonomic nervous system, and the state map is where is the autonomic nervous system in terms of fight, flight, and freeze at any point. And so we'll really take a few minutes to try to explain that process. So this is the map, and it was developed by Eric Wolterstorff, and Eric is living in Washington, D.C., I think at this point, and he's working with very large international traumas. But when he was younger, he worked with Peter Levine in the Boulder group, several very successful trauma kind of theory developers and clinical models of treatment. And Eric developed a model called CAR, Containment and Autonomic Nervous System Regulation. So let's look at the map. And so let's start with the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system that has to do with turning things on. And the parasympathetic nervous system is part of the the opposite system that has to do with turning things off. And so when your brain is processing certain levels of toxicity in the system or in the bloodstream, and it gets to a certain point, it's a homeostasis process, it activates through the sympathetic nervous system the kidneys in order to get rid of all of those toxins. And when the filtering has been done and is adequate, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system to turn the kidneys off. So what we're really talking about in terms of the stress response is that the sympathetic nervous system is what is activated as we begin to feel increasing amounts of stress, as we move from being relaxed to stressed to strongly stressed. That's a process of the sympathetic nervous system, which is actually what allows us to go into the fight and flight system. And so the parasympathetic nervous system, once the sympathetic nervous system has become overwhelmed, or the fight-flight process was not successful in making the threat go away, that the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system go into a state of what they call dual activation. And we'll explain that a little bit more later. And then it's really the activation of the dorsal vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. It takes us into a state of dissociation, where that's the kind of state, the point at which trauma is being experienced within the system. And so just a little kind of basic work. What activates these marbles, or these are actually kind of tractors, I think Levine called them tractor states, or the places where energy gets stored in the system when we experience a trauma, that because of the way our society does not support being able to kind of work it through at the time that it happens, that this energy gets stuck in the system, and that's where somatic psychotherapy, or working in with body-based kind of processes, are really important. That releases that energy. And that's part of the healing process. And so what activates this is our perceived level of threat. So this green line, if we kind of look at where the state 0, or the relaxed state, is here, that there's actually no perceived threat. And then as the threat level increases, the kind of activation of the sympathetic nervous system takes place, and the person moves into a stressed state. And so a relaxed state is calm, if you look over on the side. So what I've done, and I will make sure you get a copy of this, is the color of the marble is equated with the color or the state at which to describe what the nervous system is doing. And so state 0 is calm, responsive, awake, very little threat. As we experience more threat, or slightly anxious, minimally annoyed, a little nervous, some physical tension, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system really begins to kind of prepare the body to take action to resolve that stress. And so the muscles begin to increase in their tension, heart rate begins to go a little bit higher, our respiratory rate tends to go a little bit higher, slight release of adrenaline to activate that system. And so very few people in our society live in state 0. We all have certain kind of levels of threat. And remember, so threat in this context can be threat to our physical self, but it also can be threat associated with failure or embarrassment or being challenged, or someone's mad at me, or I've disappointed someone. And so threat can be a variety of things, and so we'll talk about that a great deal more. If someone is trying to hurt me, then that threat has the potential to become a traumatic event. And so stressed, I already said, slightly anxious, annoyed, nervous. As our threat level increases, then again, more adrenaline, more activation of the muscles, more activation of the cardiac system, moving into a fight, more of a fight and flight response. And so state 2 is highly anxious, angry, easily angered, beginning to feel more panicky kinds of feelings, intense physical tension. Stomach might be tight, chest might be tight. You'll probably notice changes in breathing, and a very powerful fight-flight response. And so if you kind of walk through from being relaxed to being stressed to being strongly stressed, you can probably imagine different times in your life and different circumstances in your life that have activated those different states, moving from, again, state 0 to state 2. Think about challenges at work. You are going to a job interview. You have to do public speaking, and a lot of people are pretty uncomfortable with public speaking. And so kind of moving from relaxed into a stressed state. Actually, being in state 1 is actually the most optimum state to be in to deal with stressful circumstances, because it does activate that system that turns on our ability to function, to problem solve, at probably our most efficient and effective process. And so we know that as the marble kind of rolls up the hill in terms of increased threat, that when it gets to about here, a little over 1.5, that the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is so significant that the blood begins to leave the prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain, to be used in other areas of our body for the fight-flight response. And what that creates is memory problems. It creates higher anxiety. It creates the inability to access important information. So things that we have learned recently become unavailable to us. And so there are different what we call memory states, and when you're moving into that level, you're moving more into a crisis kind of state. And so we know that clients who leave treatment and are in circumstances that create this level of stress tend to relapse somewhere in this area, because the things that they learned in treatment are no longer accessible to them. And I would ask you to think of a time that you've been really anxious, and afterwards, once you've calmed down, that you can think, wow, I wish I'd have said this, or I should have said this, or you remember something that you learned that could have helped to resolve that. That as the threat level increases and the sympathetic nervous system activates from being slightly anxious to being highly anxious, that we begin to see impairment of the ability to solve problems. And so as a therapist, when I was seeing a lot of clients, one of the rules that I had was that I wouldn't do talk therapy with a client when they were in state 1.5 to state 2. And what we would do is we'd go for a walk. We would do anything we can do to move that marble back down here to where talk therapy would become more effective. And I would say the same thing in terms of families, and the idea of when you have something really important to talk to your loved one about, if you are in this state up here of being really strongly stressed or moving into that direction, the likelihood that you will have success in being able to convey the important things for you. And I ask families a lot, think about a time that you really knew that you wanted to have a really important conversation with your loved one. And you sat down, you took out your notepad, and you started writing down all the things that you wanted to say, because you wanted to be really clear, and you wanted to be really sure that you said the right things, and that you weren't inflammatory, or that you weren't accusing, and those kinds of things. And that when you began to have the conversation and the loved one did not necessarily appreciate your feedback, and they became activated, and so it's like having multiple marbles in the same place when you have multiple people, that as you're trying to stay calm and you're telling them things that they may experience as threatening, like things you're going to do different, or things that have upset you, as their marble moves up the hill and they become more upset, and I say up the hill, but meaning as their sympathetic nervous system begins to activate more and they move into a more highly anxious, panicky state, then the reality is that your threat level is going to increase. And so that you're going to go to that same place, and there will be this sort of parallel process. And so I would urge you to think of a time when you were in that process, you had your notes, and as your loved one got more and more anxious and activated and angry, the notes get pushed to the side, and you begin to talk in ways that you always talk, that you actually start to say the things that you were trying to avoid by having your notes. And so we talk about that. We will always go back, believe will get us out of that significant stress. So we're trying to move out of harm's way. And so all of a sudden both people are now up here because it's now turned into an argument. And if you have two people who are highly anxious, angry, panicky, intense physical tension, and powerful fight or flight, then oftentimes one or both will begin to move into heading towards state 3, where they begin to dissociate. And what they have is that their tension begins to be reduced. We don't feel emotionally. We don't feel our bodies in the same way. We may get sleepy. We may get cold. We may have a sense of hopelessness. Some people actually have blurred vision. Some people get what they call fuzzy, meaning they're there, but they're not really physically connected. And so when that conversation or when that argument is over, the reality that either one of these two people will remember what they said is limited. They will have flashes and bits and pieces of what were said. And I always joke that we'll fight to the death that what we said was right, even though we don't remember what that was. And so, again, we're moving from being relaxed to being stressed, to being highly stressed, to being traumatized, or what we would call dissociated. And again, that's the sympathetic nervous system. And as we said, dually activated tension with somatic collapse. And what that means is that the body is still ready to fight or flight, but the connection to the body, the ability to necessarily control the body, becomes diminished. As a therapist, when I'm running a group or something like that, the first sign that I look at when I see someone who's moved into this state is the idea of being sleepy, and they're begin to yawn, and you can see that they're beginning to have a harder time keeping their eyes open, or they're wringing their hands. They begin to get cold. And then only individuals that really kind of are in the severely traumatized state move into a pure dissociative state where they lack any kind of physical sensations. Their affect or their emotions are really flat. They are kind of numb, blank, floaty. The term we use is depersonalized or disconnected. I've had many clients who have said, as we've been really working on very difficult traumas, that they begin to have almost out-of-body experiences. So this is the continuum of that autonomic nervous system response, from relaxed to stressed, strongly stressed, dually activated, and then severely traumatized. And dually activated is really an important state. And it's that phase when, particularly for traumatized clients, when the fight or flight attempt to get out of harm's way isn't working. And there's a moment of realization that whatever this threat, and again, you're looking at a pretty significant threat, when you're in this place. And so very high anxiety, very high physiological fight-flight response, that when the realization is made that whatever is happening is going to happen, and that the key thing about trauma, and the key aspect in my mind of that shift from being sympathetically driven to parasympathetically driven is the moment at which the individual accepts that they're powerless to stop whatever it is happening. And it's not necessarily a conscious process, but that whatever they've tried to use in order to stay safe and to avoid harm hasn't worked, and so they move into the dually activated state, which means that if an opportunity were to happen to get out of that situation, that they still have the physiological ability, that the tension, that the blood is still in the muscles and the adrenaline is still present, that the person could get out of harm's way if the opportunity arise, but typically they kind of stay in that place. So I hope that makes sense, so that when we, just kind of a recap, that we have these sort of tractor states, or these areas where energy kind of gets held, and that we go from that relaxed state, calm, responsive, awake, clear thinking, to stressed, slightly anxious, to strongly stressed, to more dissociated, to very dissociated. And one of the exercises that, if you're in our family program, that I will give you at some point, is to identify the circumstances in your life, maybe in your relationship with your loved one. For our clients, what are the circumstances associated with their addiction or their relationship with their family or with work or whatever that creates the sensations of being in stage 1, stressed, or state 2, strongly stressed. And the more we can identify, these are the circumstances that generally take me to this place, the more we can begin to use coping strategies to kind of prevent this energy from moving into this very strongly stressed state. So this is not a haphazard process, that this is a truly biological process, and that there's a system called the Polyvagal Theory, and there are 2 nerves that come out of the brain stem. So they're instinctual. They've evolved over 1,000 years of evolution to help us to be able to manage safety, but also to manage the physiological response to stress and to facilitate human survival. And so this is what is called the ventral vagus nerve, and it comes again. So these nerves come out of the brain stem side by side. The ventral vagus nerve wraps around the side of our face and goes into a connection with the heart. And what's interesting, we tend to think that the brain controls the heart, and there are far more what we call ascending neurons that go from the heart to the brain than from the brain to the heart. So that there is this relationship between what is perceived by the sort of instinctual kind of process of awareness and how it relates to increased heart rate, how it relates to different emotions. And we'll talk about where emotions fall on this map in a few minutes. And that a guy by the name of Stephen Porges was the first to identify the relationship of the vagus nerve, or this polyvagal system, in terms of trauma and in terms of attachment and in terms of our ability to connect to other people. And the ventral vagus nerve, its primary objective is, from the time that we're born, to assess the people around us to determine if they're safe or not. And if they are safe, then we are driven to be relational. And so, again, when we're relaxed, we have a much greater ability to connect to the people around us. And so our first defense system, when anything is going on for us, is to assess what's happening. And we assess people based on the tone of their voice and the look on their face. And if the ventral vagus nerve assesses, and I don't have the slides, I usually have slides that show different facial expressions of angry and upset people to kind of demonstrate what it is that this is looking for. But if we're a baby and we're hungry, we begin to cry, and hopefully the adults, the big people in our lives, when they come to take care of us, have a big smile on their face, and they're talking kind of in baby talk and connecting and making eye contact. And this system assesses that and then down-regulates the sympathetic nervous system, which means the marble stays in this relatively relaxed place, and that this child and that adult begin a process of what we call co-regulation, and that it is the responsibility of the adults in our lives as children to help us begin to learn how to manage our marbles, how to manage the autonomic nervous system. And so if we grew up in a family where there was a lot of trauma, if we grew up in a family where there was a lot of addiction and anxiety and people were always upset, that the relational abilities, this response of the ventral vagus nerve may be downregulated to where the sympathetic nervous system becomes the primary coping strategy. And so if I have to cry every time to get my needs met, and I have to, that my parents, my big people, my caretakers, whoever they are so busy doing other things, are so preoccupied with their own needs. Maybe they have a history of trauma. Maybe they have an addiction. Maybe they have a mental health issue and they're experiencing depression, to where if the child realizes that the only way I get their attention is to downregulate my relational desire and upregulate my sympathetic nervous system, that when I get hungry, when I have needs, I no longer stay in a relaxed place. I'm starting probably from here. And so this is needed to be in that place. If we're not able to get our needs met, we start here. And so if the child realizes that even with being anxious, so this is the beginning in my mind of being of the development of an anxious attachment. The idea of, in order for people to love me, in order for people to take care of me, that I need to activate the sympathetic nervous system to get their attention. Then that person realizes that people are not necessarily safe, people are not necessarily there for me, and that I have to be wary. I have to be more vigilant, or the term we use in trauma is hypervigilant, in order to get my needs met. And I may need to be what people need me to be rather than who I am. I may need to begin to say things that make people happy rather than saying what I really think or what I really feel. And so, many of our clients, when they come in, because of the stress and the pervasive problems that they've experienced as a result of their addiction, actually live right here, kind of in this state that's right on the cusp of being present, being able to be relaxed. But to them, this feels perfectly normal. And if you look at that and move that marble down to the threat line, they're living with an almost constant level of threat. And when we, again, if you're in the family program, we're going to do some lectures on addiction as a chronic disease, and we'll really tie this together, that the symptoms associated with that disease are biological, psychological, social, or relational, and I think spiritual, that the more progressed the disease gets, the more that person begins to realize that there's pretty much constant conflict in their lives, whether it's work or not. And they tend to move fairly quickly from here to here, meaning they go into fight-flight very quickly. So I ask clients all the time, how many of you get angry really fast? And hands go up, and they go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. Well, it's if you're kind of living in a state that's here, it requires a fairly significant amount of threat to move you from being calm and relaxed to being in that full fight or flight scenario. But if you are in a constant state of anxiety or defensiveness or avoidance, it doesn't take very much to go from being what feels normal to being really angry and defensive quickly. And if people don't back down, or people don't, if that doesn't stop the threat, they kind of go over the top and come into this state of dual activation fairly quickly. And so they don't remember a lot. There's a lot of disagreements on what was said. When arguments do happen, they will defend themselves to being right. And so it's really important to understand that so much of what we're seeing isn't haphazard, it's not random, it's very explainable based on how the individual perceives their lives as being threatening or not threatening. So if the child realizes that even being anxious, that people are not going to be there for me. And so if a child develops this relational ability, their caretakers, their sort of attachment figures, are pretty consistently present for them in a pleasant, nurturing, and loving way. If a child is pretty sympathetically driven, meaning fight, flight, anxiety, stress driven, it often means that the caretakers in our lives were inconsistently there for us, and that the person doesn't know, the child doesn't know when they're there, or when a situation's happening, they don't know what the outcome is going to be. So they stay in a fairly stressed state, down-regulating the relational abilities, up-regulating fight and flight. If the family members are consistently not present for them, then children down-regulate the sympathetic nervous system and up-regulate the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's called the dorsal vagus nerve. And again, these are two nerves that come out of the same, that split in the brain, coming out of the brain stem. And while this one is located on our face and our heart, this nerve goes down to our internal organs. And so when we're in a fight-flight response, all the blood is leaving our internal organs and moving into our arms and legs and eyes and whatever we need in order to fight and flight successfully. When that moment happens that we talked about, that whatever the threat is, it's not going to go away. And not only is it not going to go away, but it's pretty significant that the sympathetic nervous system will activate the dorsal vagus nerve, which puts us into a state of dissociation. So all the blood now leaves the arms and legs and brain and eyes, etc., that needed to fight and flight, and goes to a place at which we're most likely to succeed and survive to get through the situation. Hope that makes sense. I keep moving this. So, relational, fight, flight, anxious, dissociative, kind of freeze, we call this a freeze response. And so again, we're moving from, I want you to look at and be aware of the physiological kind of an emotional responses to each place along the way. And so I did a video, and you'll see the video on enabling, and it's not to support the existing kind of view of enabling as much as it is to say that when there is an expectation on the part of a family member that something is going to happen, meaning that there has been a set of stable patterns developed that that the family is going to pay someone's rent, and that that allows them to continue to use their drug of choice, and then the family says, well, we're not going to pay that anymore, that I would urge you as a family member, and if clients are watching this, what do you notice in your body if you were to sit quietly and begin to think about the last time a situation like that happened, and you see your loved one walking down the hall, it's rent time or whatever it is that is going on at that point, and you know they're going to ask because they always do, or you've been told not to do that, and you know that your loved one is going to be upset, and to pay attention to, what are the physical symptoms. And so often loved ones, and I want to be really clear, I think family members do what they do in order be supportive, because that's what loving families do. I'm not saying that enabling is some kind of it's a behavior that tends to maintain the status quo, meaning maintain old behaviors, rather than to kind of fix those behaviors or solve those behaviors. And so I'm going to guess, based on the many stories I've heard from other family members, that when you see that loved one come in the door, you begin, what people say is they feel their chest tighten. They feel their heart begin to race and pound. That they feel they get a kind of tightness in their shoulders and their neck. And so if we talk about that experience, look at state 2. Highly anxious, angry, fearful, panicky, intense physical tension in the stomach, neck, and breathing, chest. Powerful fight-flight response, wishing the situation were over. And so often, the reason that, and again, we'll talk about it in great detail in the boundaries and enabling lecture, but the idea of it is this level of fear and anxiety that promote the family member to say, yes, I'll give you the money, when the real answer, or the answer that they're really feeling, is no. And so again, there's a process called neurosection, that when you see your loved one walk in the door, and I ask the same question all the time, if your loved one walks in the front door of the house, how long does it take for you to determine whether they're intoxicated? And the average answer is 2 seconds. And when I ask, what's happening that it's so quick? And it's often the things that we would see as an activation of this ventral vagus nerve. It's the way they're walking. It's the tone of their voice. It's the look on their face. It's their inability to make eye contact. And so neuroception is an unconscious process that says what we have learned over the years will inform how we assess the circumstances around us in a very almost instantaneous process. And so that idea of 2 seconds to determine. So, in many cases, while that transaction is happening between the family member and the loved one, where unintended behavior is the one that's happening, that the person begins to actually feel dissociated, that they are kind of not hearing very well. They're not, they're in their own head rather than listening to what their loved one is saying. And then when the circumstance is over, they leave, they go back into a more of a higher state. What's important is that it's fear or it's threat that stimulates the shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic. And so when the circumstances is over, we tend to go back over to this place. So, and it may be that when it's over, there's great frustration that leads to being angry that they put us in that circumstance. So I hope that makes sense. That when I say to a client, where are your marbles? I'm really asking them, where are you in terms of your biological, your physiological, emotional, where's your nervous system at this point? And again, if they come into a session and they're up here, then I'm going to begin that session by doing something that's probably physical. I might have them do what's called a resourcing exercise. You'll learn that later in the family program. And we may go for a walk and go around the foundry boundary, or we could go into the gym and shoot baskets to calm the nervous system down so that we can engage in talk therapy. So, what we understand about trauma and trauma memories is that when we're in that state of where the trauma is happening, that at the point at which that blood flow begins to shift from being in the brain and moving into other parts of the body where it is needed, that it turns off a process in the brain that has to do with recording narrative or recording language. And what happens is all the sensory information that is coming in at the time of the circumstance happening is what is actually being remembered. And so that for individuals that have traumatic stress, they will stay incredibly hypervigilant and trying to be in control of their environment so that they can stay out of circumstances. Avoidance is a big part of that, of staying out of circumstances that will promote sensory experience that was similar to the sensory experience that was happening at the time of the trauma. And so things like sounds and smells, body sensations, anxiety, feelings of shame or guilt, these sort of sympathetically driven emotions, colors. Clients often talk about when they walk in the house and they've been using, or if they've done something that they know the family is not going to be supportive of, we'll talk about when they see the look on a loved one's face of anger or disappointment or frustration, and that kind of moment of realization of, oh, I did it again, or that moment of, oh man, they're mad at me again, and this whole circumstance is happening over again. That when that individual experiences these sensory experiences, and let's just say they're living in here, that the minute they have that look, the sympathetic nervous system begins to activate, creating that more fight or flight response. And I'll give you an example. I've worked with I'll just give you one example. I have a former client who was an EMT, and he responded to many life-threatening accidents and things like that. And so the smell that was most triggering to him was the smell of gasoline. And so that when he would be working on filling his gas tank on his truck, if he got a really strong smell of gasoline, that the smell actually triggered the same smell that he smells at the time of most of the traumatic events that he goes to, actually triggers a kind of a fight-flight response for him. And so if it's other calls, he may not have that same response. But just the smell of gas begins to activate that sympathetic nervous system. And for clients, we'll talk about you in a second, but for family members, when I say, how long does it take to recognize your loved one's state of impairment? If it's, one person was telling me it's the click of his heels on the floor. Because they've heard that so many times. It's the shuffle of his feet on the hardwood. It's the look on his face. So sights, smells, images, taste, any of those kinds of responses. Certain body sensations, tightness in the shoulders and neck. So that anything that you're can become aware of that triggers this movement of this marble from being slightly stressed to being highly stressed in relation to your loved one's addiction or your loved one's trauma will be really important for helping us to help you to not let that get to a point at which it becomes overwhelming for you, and it allows you to begin to problem solve. And so it's really important to understand how we remember things in terms of the sensory experience that was going on when the event happens. for clients, we're working on really difficult memories in terms of what we call recovery milestones. And one of the first ones is the commitment to abstinence and ongoing recovery. And oftentimes clients will come in and they're wanting to, okay, I'm not going to drink, but I'm still going to smoke weed, or I'm not going to do opiates, but I'm still going to use marijuana or something along those lines. And the belief that it's not an addiction to everything, I have a drug of choice, and that's really what I need to kind of manage. And so we are going to have those conversations where it's like recovery is about abstinence. And so as clients begin to put the connection between their life consequences and their chemical use, who they now see themselves as, recurrent thoughts and feelings and behaviors that are associated with the use of drugs or alcohol, or their procurement of drugs or alcohol, the things that create these consequences in their lives, the things that they've said to you as family members, things that have happened in social relationships. As we're working on these difficult memories, as we're working on things like the steps of AA and NA with powerlessness and acceptance and being rigorously honest and not lying to anyone, that sometimes just walking into a therapy session, walking into like one of the therapist's offices and seeing the circumstances around them based on difficult conversations that they've had and the sensory experiences that they have. Just walking into the therapist's office can begin to create more of a fight-flight response. And so for clients, this idea of threat, they make the mistake of thinking it's a physical threat. I'm not afraid of anybody. I'm not afraid of you. Rather than the threat is in the conversations that we're going to have. And I'm of the opinion that successful therapy is based on a foundation of difficult conversations, of really allowing people to work on the things that are really scary to them, that are painful for them, that create the most resistance for them. And a lot of times it's higher power or spirituality, or continuing care. I'm going home. I'm not going to sober living. I'm not going to go to those meetings. I'm not going to do those things. And so for the client, the activation or the shift between autonomic nervous system states, again, relational, this is the ventral vagus nerve, fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system. Freeze and dissociation is the dorsal vagus nerve. It doesn't matter what the threat is. If that person is here or above, talking to them is a waste of time. And trying to have a meaningful conversation with that person is difficult, and that's why we don't do that. But at home, so one of the things we want to talk about in family, in the family program, is how do we manage these marbles in order to allow for more useful and helpful conversations. And so the last of the slides that have to do with the marbles is, I want you to think about the fight or flight process and the process of being really relaxed. And so often, clients stay in a almost constant state of distrust and caution and vigilance and hostility. And often those cover great fear and worry and shame and sadness that are associated with the circumstances of their life. And I want you to understand that if you're in a state of relaxation and you're in a state of very low threat, it's highly unlikely that you're even going to think about these feelings. At this point, there's going to be a great gratitude. I'm really just happy to be alive, and love and joy and inspiration, trust, peace, easy problem solving, the ability and the willingness to kind of think through difficult conversations. And so if I want you to think about what are the pervasive emotions that you have, or the pervasive thoughts that you have in your life. And if they're in this area, doubt and fear and frustration and anger and sadness, that probably means that your nervous system is always somewhere between 1 and 2 on the state map. And again, if we can help you begin to manage your autonomic nervous system and kind of move into more of a 0 to 1 state, then we can help you begin to experience more of these sort of positive feelings. And so the last slide, and this will be the end of this this aspect of, or this lecture, is that where you are in your level of perceived threat and where you are in your autonomic nervous system map, where your marbles are, that it's going to impact what thoughts you have, what emotions you have, what you're going to feel in your body, and what your impulse is to do to get out of that state. And so I have both of these posters. They're slightly different than this in my office, and I can watch someone begin to get activated and watch their sort of marble begin to kind of move up to indicate more anxiety, more stress, more frustration. And I can ask them to stop talking, and I can sort of move to them with, what are you thinking? Like, what's going on underneath the conversation that we're having? And we always have these sort of dialectical discussions going on in our head, where we're going to have one discussion with you, and then these thoughts that are actually almost like meta conversations about what am I thinking about my level of threat, or what am I thinking about the conversation that we're having. As a marriage counselor, my PhD is in marriage and family therapy. I can watch two people get ready to have an argument, and when I stop them before the argument and walk through this, it's pretty fascinating that if they could have just begun to realize that I'm beginning to feel something different. I'm more angry and frustrated, and I'm beginning to think, oh man, we've had this discussion all the time. This is not a useful conversation. Or they can begin to feel the tightening of their chest, and begin to realize that all of these things are going to tie together to stimulate some kind of behavior. And it may be having an argument. It may stimulate an argument. It may stimulate, it's not worth it. I'm just going to, I can't get out of this discussion, so I'm just going to dissociate through it. And so it's important to understand, so multiple things. Number one is, in the moment, it's really important to understand, I'm finding myself moving into a more anxious state. So what are we talking about? What am I thinking? And why is it being experienced by my body as a threatening discussion? Because if it wasn't threatening, you'd still be very relaxed. Why am I getting a headache from this discussion? That's a somatic experience. Because what we're talking about is threatening. So that's one, is in the moment. If you can learn how to calm that down, then you can begin to change the way you have conversations. You can begin to change the way you have your behavioral responses to your loved one and their addiction, or to your family and their concerns about your addiction. You can begin to process emotions in a way that's different. So that's one. The second thing is, if we kind of go back to the polyvagal system, and a lot of families get really frustrated with me because I talk to them on a regular basis about, what was your family of origin like? And that what we experienced as children, based on this slide, is going to become our primary organizing principle for problem solving, relationships, attachment, dealing with conflict, and those kinds of things. And that I don't ask you to look at your own family of origin from a blaming perspective or a shaming perspective. But what we learned in our family of origin, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is driving much of our responses today. And so that idea about, why do I feel so much of this all the time when I thought my family was pretty fine? I thought we were great. And is it about your loved one's addiction? Or is it that that's been there long before that? Is it about marriage? Is it about being a kid in a family with lots of trauma and addiction? So if you're in the family program, and if you're in the residential program, I'm asking you to step back and really get good at understanding how your marbles move. What are the things that threaten you? Again, not physically, and if it's physically, then it's physical, but what are the things that you perceive as threat because they're embarrassing? What are the things that you perceive as threat because, you don't want to be in trouble, or you don't want to have an argument, or you don't want to have... So, I think the reason that I'm having you watch this video so early in the family program at the very beginning is so that we can use this kind of process to understand what's creating so much distress for you. And again, I'm a firm believer that, I like the concept of prodependency rather than codependency. And the idea that prodependency is what loving families do. It may not make the problem go away or the crisis go away, but it's done for the right reasons, and it's done out of love, and it's done out of care. But it's still important to look at history, to look back. So I hope this is helpful. Really appreciate you taking the time to watch it, and I look forward to talking to you at some point in the very near future. Thanks.